Regina, good to see you again, sir.
Good to be back.
So why did you introduce this government motion?
Well, I was in India on a trade mission, and at least winding it up when I heard about the press conference, the joint statement by Ontario and Quebec, and it's of great concern. You know, of all of the pipelines that are proposed, I thought Energy East would be the least controversial for a number of reasons. People, obviously, your viewers will know it replaces foreign oil imports into Canada. A lot of others, by the way, in the country would not know that an Energy Power, a major oil producer like Canada, has to import oil in eastern Canada from places like Iraq and Venezuela and Algeria. Here's a chance for us to replace that import with Canadian oil, with Western Canadian oil from our two provinces, actually add value to it here in the refineries, get it to those refineries at a West Texas price that's a little bit better than Brent. There'll still be some export opportunity that gives us then access to a better Brent price for the Canadian resource. All the while, obviously adhering to the National Energy Board process for approval for these pipelines. This just makes eminent good sense for the country. Disproportionately will economically benefit Ontario and then Quebec, and that's true from a tax revenue perspective as well. And I'm just hearing, you know, I'm hearing what might constitute unnecessary barriers coming from the two provinces, especially the call for some sort of GHG analysis of the pipeline, which is not a part of the NEB process, and I think sets a dangerous precedent for not just hydrocarbons moving across Canada, but all goods and services. So, you know, you just had a segment on wine. We're just getting our act together, reducing barriers to move wine across the country.
Right.
We need to have improved internal trade in Canada, and here we're putting up potentially new barriers to what I think is just a common sense project that we need to consume Canadian oil in Canada, add value to it here, access a better export price, create jobs and investment in the country. I hope we don't get in the way of that project at the provincial level.
Now, as you know, a lot of legwork and consultation has already been done on the Energy East pipeline. So are you surprised that Ontario and Quebec have put these barriers up?
I am. There's already, I think, 56 agreements with First Nations along the way. There will be a consultation with 155 communities that are affected with all of the stakeholders. There's $2.5 million set aside to enable those who can't afford to intervene and present to the National Energy Board to do so. The safety piece is going to be obviously fully vetted. So will the environmental side of things from the pipeline perspective. In terms of presentations. Obviously Ontario and Quebec have certain questions around these issues, and they should be answered at that process. They should have the chance to present. But let's not start talking about attaching GHGs to this. I mean, we don't do that with respect to the large amount of Quebec steel that comes into Western Canada because we're expanding and building here. It just sets a dangerous precedent. One final point. You know, if we're not moving oil in a pipeline, which isn't perfect, but it's the safest, most efficacious way to do so, we'll have more oil on rail. This is not about oil sands oil. As you know, for the most part, we're talking about conventional oil in Energy East. Light sweet crude from the Bakken in Saskatchewan will be a part of that in this pipeline. And if it's on a rail, we know the risks are greater. And we lived as a country the absolute tragedy that happened with respect to a major accident and loss of life. And so here's the chance to get more rail in a pipeline and more oil in a pipeline, less on the rail. That's an also added benefit that should commend this project to all provincial governments, to Canadians, that this is the right thing to do.
Premier Wall, we had the National Energy Board's CEO, Mr. Watson, on the other day here at BNN. He says it's fair and appropriate for Quebec to conduct its own review of Energy East. What do you think of that? What's your reaction?
Well, as long as it doesn't add delay. I mean, I think they can conduct their review and I guess share a copy, provide it to or present and have standing before the NEB, fair enough. But it ought not to delay it for the reasons we mentioned. Let's also remind viewers that this is mostly a conversion. 2/3 of this is pipeline in the ground already. 1/3 of it's new pipeline. Let's remind viewers that it does take oil off of rail. Let's remind people in the debate as Quebec does its due diligence that we ought not to be importing oil from Iraq and Algeria and Venezuela, by the way, which has a bigger GHG footprint, if that's your thing, or the United States. So fair enough, do the assessment from Quebec's point of view. I respect that. I've talked to Premier Couillard about it. Provide it to the NEB if that's probably the best place in terms of standing. But let's make sure we don't delay this interminably or worse because we're an energy power, we really are, based on the reserves we have, but boy, we don't act like it when we are potentially putting barriers in the way of what is a project that makes eminently good sense and is good for Quebec and good for Ontario, for Atlantic Canada, good for the country. And
lastly, Premier Wall, and maybe in about 30 seconds if you could, you mentioned GHG emissions. Who should be reviewing those, if anybody?
Well, right now it's not part of the prescribed program, and we don't even know how the measure would take place. Do you just measure the life cycle of what's in the pipeline, the conventional oil? Is it the pipeline as well? Do we add that, the steel that made the pipeline? Is it the transportation process? And if we're going to do it for oil, are we going to do it for Quebec steel that comes into our province and for other goods that go across Canada? I think this is a very dangerous precedent to set unless we make some fundamental decisions about what exactly we're measuring.
Thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall joining us from Regina. That is it for Taking Stock. Thanks for being with us. Up